So I'm Art Kaplan, and I direct the Center for Bioethics here at Penn. And we're going to talk a bit about the rather thorny subject of conflict of interest. And I think what I'll do is talk about it for a while, and then we can do some question and answer about it. So I promise I won't lecture you for more than 40 minutes or something, but just bear with me as I try to take you through some of the basics here. And what I'm going to talk to you about is this. First, I'm going to tell you about the protections that exist for people in research and why conflict of interest loomed up as important there. And that has to do with a case called Jesse Gelsinger. Second, I'm going to tell you about some of the issues that come up around conflict of interest in therapy. That's not research issues, but therapy questions, some of which have had special bearing on some topics or areas around the neurosciences. That certainly has come up, although hardly unique to there. Then I'm going to give you some definitions about what conflict of interest consists of. I'm going to hold those off until I give you a little of that history, and then talk some about management of conflict of interest, what people are thinking about in order to handle conflict of interest both in research and in therapy. So the goal is that you understand what is a conflict of interest. The goal is also to let you know how we have sort of wrestled with it over time, and then to think about some of the mechanisms that are out there for coping with conflict of interest, because the truth is that you're not going to get rid of conflict of interest anytime soon. It's just a reality that it's present in a lot of research in neuroscience. It's present in a lot of therapy that people do. I mean, it can be as basic as, I want to do deep brain stimulation on somebody with Parkinsonism. There are other treatments out there. Don't I have a conflict of interest if I favor the one that I happen to make money giving as my mode of treatment? So they're around, and I think you can't get rid of them completely, but there are ways to manage them, I think, that serve both subjects and patients, the public interest, and the interest of the biomedical community too. The protections that are in place on the research side, let's talk about that for a minute. So if you're a subject in research, we live in a system that says you choose to be one. No one drafts you. No one coerces you. We don't even try to guilt you all that much about being a subject. So we could come along and say, gee, you're taking the benefits of advances in scientific research. Shouldn't you be a subject in research? I think the only place they actually try that argument a little bit is in intro psych classes. But short of that, in general, you have to say, I would like to volunteer. Now, people have different motives to volunteer. Somebody's a volunteer because they have an illness, and they would like to get access to some intervention that might benefit them. In other instances, people volunteer just to contribute to overall knowledge and let people understand things they know they won't benefit. Some studies are designed with only safety demonstrations or even just basic physiological exploration in mind. So if a neuroscientist wants to know what part of your brain lights up when you're exposed to, say, face recognition, you're not going to benefit from that particularly, but you will hopefully contribute some understanding to neuroscience that might someday be put to use, or at least it's information that people might find valuable intrinsically. You might volunteer to be in studies in addition to scanning that look at the associations between particular genes and particular behaviors, some of which might have medical consequences, but some of which just might be curiosity. Why do people with better short-term memory have a different gene around or something like that? Just a sort of curiosity question. So when you think research, a lot of people tend to think, oh, you mean like medical research to find drugs or cures? I don't. I mean all kinds of research that's out there. You have to volunteer, you have to choose, as I said. You have to, in other words, give your informed consent. And the first key protection for subjects who volunteer for research is that we give them information. We try to get their informed consent. So you may need to know what the risks are. You may need to know that you could get claustrophobic in a scanner. and that might be uncomfortable for you. You might need to know that in doing some research, you will be in a group that doesn't get an active agent. It's going to be a placebo-controlled trial, so you may not get anything out of being in the research. You need to know that there may be something beneficial for you. Some forms of research, when you're involved in it late in the process, people may already have established that something might be helpful for your neurological disease, but it's not completely proven. But still, you might benefit if you were in a study that's been going on for a while. So there are different risk and benefit sets of information that you need to know. In addition to that, you're going to want to know what are my alternatives and options. In the classic Psychology 1 class, they may say, oh, well, we don't force anybody to be in our research experiments in the psych department. You just have to write a 50-page paper if you don't want to do it. So the option may be 50-page paper, be in social psych experiment. I, in my life, always chose the social psych experiment, but I'm sure there are others who signed up for the 50-page paper somewhere. But there are often options, and one option is to do nothing. You don't have to be in an experiment, so you could say, I don't want to do anything experimental here, and I don't want to write the 50-page paper. I don't think either of those options is enough. I shouldn't be penalized if I don't want to participate in research. So you need to know the risks and benefits you face. You need to know your options, and you need to know that you can leave or drop out. Obviously, we're presuming here that you're competent. You can understand all this. I don't want to talk right now about people who have mental illness or other competency impairments, but informed consent is a key protection. Historically, it's there for one simple reason. Many people argued historically that it's worth putting people into experiments to learn things if you only have to use a small number of them and it benefits a large number of people. A classic utilitarian or consequentialist argument. That led people to even drag minority populations into very dangerous or lethal experiments. We're going to look for the cure for typhus. We're going to try and understand hypothermia. And as you know, in World War II, both the Germans and the Japanese did conduct sort of forced experiments on populations, but the justification was we're going to learn so much that even if we kill some of these subjects, it's worth it. So the reason informed consent loomed up large historically is it was a response to the consequentialist or utilitarian argument saying, no matter how much knowledge you might gain, we're still going to insist that you have to volunteer to do it. You can't drag an individual or a group into research, even if you'd get great benefit and learn a lot. We're not going to accept that argument. It's up to the individual to decide to contribute or choose. So that's informed consent. Second big protection, which I can describe much more quickly, is institutional review boards, but that's just a fancy term for peer review. And the reason they came into existence was that sometimes researchers weren't telling the truth about the risk and the benefit. So a researcher who wanted to recruit subjects, let's just say hypothetically an assistant professor pushing for tenure in the neuroscience department of the Penn Medical School, may be downplaying the risk and not really aggressively talking about the options and alternatives because they need subjects so they can get their articles written and get tenured and, I don't know, go on to write more articles. So the pressure that the researcher is on may lead them to cut corners on the information on the informed consent. The antidote to that was to set up committees that take a look at the consent forms and also evaluate the research protocol to make sure that the science is legit, the risk-benefit ratio is not crazy, and that the informed consent form is accurate. They try to question the investigator. They can often say it's not information that's easily understood, rewrite it, that sort of stuff. That actually came out of the Tuskegee study, for those of you who are buffs of history, because in the Tuskegee study, people were told they were getting treatment, they weren't, and they were lied to, but they also obtained their consent, even though the men were illiterate, they signed forms with a big X. So the argument was we can't just trust the researcher to get the consent. We have to have someone else take a look. That's the evolution of, in the U.S., institutional review boards. Overseas, they're called ethics committees, but it's the same idea, peer review. So everybody follow that. We got informed consent, we got peer review. And then comes conflict of interest as the third protection of people in research. And this comes about really in relatively recent times. People didn't worry about this too much until a young man named Jesse Gelsinger died in an experiment at Penn back about 10 years ago. Jesse Gelsinger was a young man who had a mild form of a disease called OTC deficiency. And it doesn't matter too much what that disease is, other than for those of you who know it, it's like PKU disease. Certain proteins, if they're in your diet, cause an allergic reaction and can also cause the buildup of gunk in your cells that can cause, well, it can cause mental retardation and harm. OTC acts just like PKU, except what happens with the OTC disease is you build up nitrogen, which is not a happy substance to have. Urea builds up in your cells, poison your cells. It can cause your death. In mild forms, it could cause cognitive impairment and other problems. Happily for Jesse Gelsinger, he did have a very mild form of the disease. It's caused by genetic mutations, so it could be severe to pretty mild. So all he needed to do was watch his diet. If he kept certain proteins, meat, for example, out of his diet, he was pretty much okay. The lifespan of a person with this disorder is not the normal lifespan, but you can live 30, 40 years before the urea starts to build up in your cells enough to cause you real harm. So, people had realized some time ago that a special diet would help you if you had this disease. But one category of person it doesn't help much is the severe case. A baby with severe OTC disease is going to be dead within 48 to 72 hours. The exposure to either mother's milk or formula kills them. That same protein they can't tolerate. So if you have a really severe case of this, you can't tolerate it. Researchers here were thinking about trying to use gene therapy, which you've probably all heard of. Gene therapy just means finding some type of way to deliver genes into a cell that will replace something that's defective or missing genetically. So you're trying to insert genetic information. There is one thing in life that loves to insert genetic information into cells. It's viruses. They love to shoot their genes into normal cells and then take them over and replicate. If you could get a virus to put in the right portion of the gene that is necessary for making this enzyme that helps you cope with proteins, you might be able to blunt or reverse the course of this disease. So, gene therapy was looking around for different diseases to test out the idea that you could engineer viruses and put them in to people's bodies. Literally put them in, like you could inhale them into your windpipe or into your lungs, cystic fibrosis. You might try to put them in your bloodstream to repair something, anemia. The bubble boy disease is something that's been treated with gene therapy, just putting it in the blood circulation for severe immune deficiency. And in the case of this disorder, your liver, where a lot of digestion takes place, maybe you could infuse the liver, put a tube in and shoot these viruses in, and they would infect the liver and put in the right genes into the cells. The problem is when you're doing this, the body instantly recognizes these viruses as attackers and tries to kill them. There was no way that they could put these viruses in and have them stay there very long without getting them an immune response and attack like a cold virus or something else. Still, if the babies could get enough relief from the allergic response they're having to the protein, maybe they could save them long enough to get the protein out of their diet, put them on protein-free diets and substitutes, and let them grow up like Jesse Gelsinger had, who had the mild form of the disease. So they proposed a study. And the study was, to use a bridge, meaning gene therapy, to temporarily be given, knowing that the viruses were going to be attacked, but long enough, hopefully, that a baby with a severe disorder would survive exposure to milk or mother's milk and then be put on a special diet later. So we're talking a couple of days survival, not any, not years, just a few days of effect, but maybe enough to rescue. Well, I don't have to tell you much more about the Jesse Gelsinger study other than to tell you this. Jesse Gelsinger died in this study. He was the 17th subject. He died because he turned out to be allergic to the protein coat of the virus that was put into him. He died here. He died in the ICU, a rather miserable, slow death. He had given informed consent, so that protection was in place. The experiments had been reviewed by many groups, institutional review boards of the Children's Hospital and of Penn, the FDA, the NIH. It was probably the most reviewed experiment in the history of experiments, reviewed by at least 4 different groups. The consent form was pretty good. Had told him he might be hurt or die. He couldn't benefit. Could he benefit? He couldn't. He was already on the diet, and he had a mild form of the disease. There was nothing in it for him to be in this study. But because he had a mild form of the disease, you could see whether the virus was making anything useful, because it would bump up the levels of the enzyme that you want. So you couldn't give it to healthy volunteers. We all, if we're healthy here, we all make that enzyme. You can't measure anything. If you put the virus in our liver, there's no way to tell whether it did anything. But in a mild case, you could see whether his enzyme levels rose up a little bit. So that's why they pick people with mild form of the disease. The lead investigator on this study is an expert pediatrician in the disease, and his collaborator is a person who makes vectors and viruses and engineers them for gene therapy, and his name was Jim Wilson. Jim also owned a company, and the company was dedicated to engineering viruses and was a for-profit little biotech startup that said, we're going to sell technology to make viruses. Well, when Jesse Gelsinger died, there was a lot of media attention, a lot of public attention, a lot of criticism. And they said, how could a young man, 19 years old enough to consent, but still relatively young, be in a study where he couldn't benefit himself with such an experimental thing? It must be because they didn't pay attention to his welfare because they wanted to make money by selling gene therapy technology, engineering the viruses. The charge was that his death was due to conflict of interest on the research side. That the researcher who was studying gene therapy owned a company that made gene therapy. There was a few other little facts. There had been some animal data, and they had seen some questionable reactions to some of these vectors in animals, but they proceeded and tried to fix the vectors. Should that have happened? Was that driven by money and the desire to succeed? In addition to that, Jesse Gelsinger, the day he was in the experiment, was not technically supposed to be in the experiment that day because a woman who was supposed to be the next subject, there were 20 altogether, he was 17, didn't show up, and they put him in. So they went out of order. When Jesse Gelsinger was in the study, he also had certain physiological measurements that they had to wait until they calmed down before they could administer the virus to him. Did they ignore safety issues because of conflict of interest? This case became the nuclear bomb of conflict of interest on the research side. It has been there ever since. People have been trying to figure out, what do we do to make sure people who own what it is they're trying to study or work on aren't in a position to recruit the subjects. It's a separate question as to whether conflict of interest from money had anything to do with the death of Jesse Gelsinger. I happen to think it didn't. I happen to think that just the motivation to try, remember I told you how weird this disease is and how it was just a bridge? People who were investing in gene technology were unimpressed that this might work. It wasn't a moneymaker. I mean, it just was so, you had to infuse it in the liver. It was only going to be good for 2 days. This wasn't the road to a fortune for Jim Wilson and Mark Batshaw, his helper. It may have been the road to something else, which we can get to later in conflict of interest, which is I want to be first, I want to be successful, but it wasn't money, I don't think. Doesn't matter what I think. What was true was people said money may have played a role here and we are going to do something about that. So the rules since then in research are this. You should not and ought not study what you own. If you have an ownership interest in a company, patent, equity, either get rid of it or put it in a trust, or you hire someone else to do the research and you don't do it yourself. So manage the conflict either by divesting, manage the conflict by perhaps finding someone else to do the work, and disclose the conflicts to the subjects. You must tell them, I am making this new hip device and I own it. I am setting up a chain of deep brain stimulation clinics around New England, and I'm going to do research on them to see if it helps with depression, and I have this ownership interest that if it works, someday maybe I'll own a chain of therapeutic deep brain stimulation clinics. So I have to tell you that as a prospective subject. So disclosure, minimize financial conflict, and really follow the principle, don't study what you own. And that pretty much is the conflict of interest story on the research side. Informed consent was good, peer review was good, but we really now live in a day and age where a lot of research is funded by people who have equity interest, monetary return as a possibility, or in conjunction with industry. And those have to be disclosed and minimized. So that's the research story. On the therapy side, this is less of a history. There's always been issues around conflict of interest when you're just giving treatments. For example, there's been a long-standing rule that, say you're a doctor prescribing medicine, you shouldn't own the pharmacy. So fee splitting, as it's sometimes called. I shouldn't make an arrangement if I'm a radiologist with a neurologist to say, okay, I'll do the imaging and then I'll send the patient on to you for the surgery and we'll split the fees. That's a conflict of interest in terms of my having an incentive to find something that he might want to work on in your head. So it's always been a problem out there, but it's gotten worse in recent years because of the rise of the influence of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of promoting products. So you've all heard about these issues where doctors are being taken out for meals and wined and dined to get them to adopt a particular drug. You know that there are situations in which doctors are hired to promote the company message, go to give talks at professional meetings and talk about the wonders of drug X, but not mentioning that there might be a cheaper drug Y or maybe some other approach to an illness. You know, I can't sleep, so I'm going to sell you sleep aids. But maybe what I should tell you about is get more exercise, or why don't you seek out some family therapy because maybe you have something that's stressing you or whatever the story may be. Well, I don't have to say that. All I'm going to say is sleep aids are good. This company makes a nice one. I'm all for it. And I don't have to tell you that they paid me $10,000 to come give you the speech. There are also other sources of conflict of interest that are out there on the therapy side. Scientists may, in addition to being on speakers bureaus, they may get funding from the industry and not disclose it, and then you find out that they're promoting a particular therapy recommendation because they have other money coming in either to support their institution or as gifts. Somebody's making donations to the clinic or their cause. This turns out to be a problem, by the way, for a lot of patient groups like the National Association for the Mentally Ill or other groups. They kind of look around for support from the industry, but then people turn around and say, but you can't take industry money. It's going to skew your objectivity about recommending what procedures or treatments people with mental illness should pursue. So therapy has been a real hotbed of conflict of interest because money and the ability to make a lot of money has grown exponentially in the past 30 years in medicine. It's that simple. It was pretty poor pickings for a while there. You just had, you had conflicts and people made some money, but now, we spend probably 10% of the trillions of dollars we spend on healthcare just on the drug side of the budget. There's big money out there to be made, and people watch it and try to influence what gets prescribed. People want to encourage the prescription of name brand drugs as opposed to generic drugs, and many, many areas where there could be conflict. So there we've seen the rise in recent years of attempts to restrict conflict of interest on the therapy side. You should not allow anybody to take money from a manufacturer to give talks. Institutions have adopted those policies. You shouldn't take money beyond small amounts from any private source. Institutions have adopted those policies. You should be very wary about freebies and handouts, and you must report them as both income and that you do take them. The medical school here runs a huge website in which even us ethicists are caught up in it, and we have to say, who is it that gave us any outside income? So many people in the neuroscience field will have to disclose, I went to this school and gave a talk and they gave me an honorarium, or I went to this drug company and gave a speech and they gave me an honorarium, or I'm on a speakers bureau for such and so and I got this money. There's a lot of transparency involved. But in the therapy end, the move has been pretty strenuous to try and stop the practices that create the biggest conflict of interest. Not just be transparent, but limit them. So that's the therapy side. So we have both conflict of interest in research, we have conflict of interest on therapy. There are stories about why that's emerged as important, both in research and therapy. In research, it's really the death of somebody in a subject where there were industry ties. In therapy, it's the rise of money and the ability to make lots more money that's probably generated the therapy end. And just to reinforce that last point, there's a lot of money there. You look at the advertising budgets that drug companies spend on your television set, it's a lot of dough moving. So they make a lot of profit by selling and distributing drugs. And if they can influence who's prescribing or influence what's stocked in the pharmacy, or influence the decision of the people who run pharmacy benefits things like Caremark or Express Scripts to buy drug A over drug B, we're talking real money. Big money starts to be important. So and obviously there are pressures both to have objectivity in what is prescribed to you, but also to contain the cost. And conflict of interest can rub up against that on the therapy side. So it's money that I think has driven that. So having done all that, let me quickly say, the next step, remember I told you I was going to tell you, well, what is a conflict of interest? Having told you about these histories. And I think there are two main kinds of conflict of interest. One involves roles and one involves objectivity. You could think about it as bias, if you like, but let's use the word objectivity. One way you can have a conflict of interest is whether you're in research or just prescribing or recommending a treatment to somebody. It may be that your role is diverted. So let's take a simple case in research. If I'm making a lot of money to help a private company investigate a drug, they hired me to do that as part of my academic job. They like me because I'm a well-known pharmacologist or I'm a famous cognitive neuroscientist, and IBM or somebody wants to get my views on things, or Siemens or some big company. I may say, I'm going to put my time into that lucrative thing that I'm doing and spend a little less time worrying about my teaching. That's a conflict of role. So I'm supposed to, as an academic, worry about my teaching first, but all of a sudden I have this lucrative outside thing that's making me worry about the work that I could do outside. If I get pulled and tugged too much, I have a role conflict that I have to manage. If I'm in a role where I have graduate students and all of a sudden I say, the project you really ought to work on is the one that is involved with this industry thing. Why? Because I'd like to be able to move that faster. It may not be the best project for you to work on in terms of basic science, but it's the best one for me in terms of advancing my personal interest, making money for me. I have a role conflict now because instead of trying to educate or tell my graduate students and mentor them, I'm trying to put them into my labor pool all of a sudden, and now they're my workforce as opposed to my students, so to speak. So I'm not really treating them as a mentor, I'm now treating them as an employer. Role conflict. Role conflicts come up, a lot of the time. They're just omnipresent, but when you have bigger financial stakes involved, and the neuroscience field is becoming more and more influenced by this, whether it's neuropharmacology or other things, you can see pressures put. Let's take another simple one just about me. It's great. I like to talk to the public. I like to talk about ethics issues on the media. Well, how much time am I going to do that? Should I do it 50% of my time? Should I say, I don't think I'm going to go to class tonight because I do have an invitation to appear on, some lofty media thing, so I'll blow that off. That's a role conflict. Assumedly, I'm hired here to be a professor. My personal view is I should never blow off any class because that's my priority, but I know people who say, well, I'll take the chance to be on TV. Whether that's right or wrong, that's a conflict of your roles. So you're trying to manage it that way. You all will be familiar with these dilemmas as they come up even in your personal life. How much time do I spend in the lab? How much time do I spend with my family? You do remember family? Anyway, how much is recreation? How much is work? I mean, they're mundane too, but they're always around. And I think what we're seeing now is a concern that fields like neuroscience are pushed more because of the attractiveness and the rapid growth to start to capture faculty, to start to capture research agendas, to put them more to private interests or other interests other than, let's say, academic goals and interests. So everybody follow that role conflict? Then there's problems that can influence your impartiality. In some of the roles you're in, you're supposed to be neutral or impartial. But if someone provides you with an incentive or a kind of reward, it might undermine your objectivity. When I taught at the University of Minnesota, the state legislature gave money to the University of Minnesota. Why? Well, partly for economic reasons. They wanted to graduate people who might contribute to the economic advancement of the state. But also they wanted a place which could be a source of reliable information about things. They often would say, Mr. Faculty Member, come in here and tell us about, since it's Minnesota, agriculture. Tell us about seeds or GMO food or whatever. Might be a climate person. Is it going to warm up here finally? We are all for global warming if we're in Minnesota. So, but they may have all kinds of questions about social policy issues, anything you could think of, including things like crime and violence reduction. Any neuroscientists know anything of interest there? We would like to hear about that. Can you tell me whether I should submit this evidence in court? Imaging, so forth. So I'd like to hear about that. So there are all kinds of agendas, and they want to have some impartial source of information. But now it turns out that half the faculty at the ag school, or some of the faculty who work on cognitive and neuroscience issues, they're all hand in glove or working with and getting some outside income from imaging companies. Can I trust them? Is their objectivity going to be there if they are talking to particular interest groups? And worse, maybe even getting paid by them. So things that can undermine your objectivity can introduce bias into your thinking. That's a conflict of interest because it makes you less impartial about things. There are even things, to come back to Jesse Gelsinger. I want to get tenure. Well, that's a pretty good driver. I want to get promoted. I would like to be recognized as the inventor or the first success with gene therapy. Not everything that makes for a conflict of interest of role or objectivity has to be money, but people tend to focus in on the monetary side of that, a little less on the ambition side of that. So there are really two kinds of conflict that are out there, roles and bias, And those are the things that we look for in terms of managing conflict of interest. And that lets me get to the, let me give you, this is a real example I brought in here. So some of you know that there's a DNA company out there called 23andMe. And it advertises on the web, and you can spit in a cup and send your DNA sample off to them, and they will send you back information about risk factors that they think might be associated with your genes, or increasingly factors in your genes that might influence how you metabolize drugs. Pharmacogenomics, a very rapidly growing part of genetic testing, which will soon intersect with neuroscience in a big way. So I might find out that my dopamine receptors are slow, or my ability to be stimulated by something is fast, and this could be a genetically linked risk factor or probability or disposition. So that world is all churning. One of the people who got tested and was written up in the New York Times was a Sergey Brin. Anybody know who he is? Google. So Mr. Brin said he had himself tested and found out that he carried the gene mutation using 23andMe for high risk of some forms of Parkinsonism. And he thought this was interesting, and he would watch out for this, and he was pleased that he had been tested. What he didn't say was that his wife is the CEO of 23andMe. And so the New York Times story just reported his pleasure in being tested and finding out this information. Now, I was interested in this myself because I'm not sure we have great Parkinson's tests yet for genetics of Parkinsonism, so that caught my eye. I was sort of like, I wonder. But anyway, more to the point, readers might want to know that this guy is endorsing this, and his wife is the CEO of the other company, and Google is clearly invested in 23andMe. So that would be a reason to doubt the objectivity of Mr. Brin's testimonial. That's what I mean about when I say there are things that can undermine your willingness to say that's a reliable statement. I might have started out thinking the head of Google, pretty smart. If he likes genetic testing, that might be interesting if he got something out of it. But I'm a little less thrilled to find out that they're kind of like interconnected like this. Maybe I want to hear a testimonial about the value of genetic testing from somebody else, a little less, dare I say, in bed with the company. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about things that undermine objectivity. That was just a relatively recent example that came up. Let me give you one other example, and then I'll get to the management issues, and I can stop talking. There was a paper that appeared, and I got into this controversy, and it does have a neuroscience angle because it asked the question, when does a fetus feel pain? Very interesting empirical question. Hard to answer because fetuses don't talk to us much, and you have to use, obviously, surrogate measures to decide whether that's a pain response. Plus, fetuses tend to be located inside mothers and hard to measure their responses. You may image them or ultrasound them, and if you're really getting a cooperative mom, maybe slip a tube in somehow and see what the fetus is up to. But generally, they're kind of off in their little aquatic world, kind of isolated from us, and it's hard for us to know what exactly is a response. Now, we do have other ways to get information. Sadly, fetuses die. We can see how much their brain is developed or interconnected. There are sometimes reasons surgically why you have to go in and do something to the fetus, so you do have that. But in the controversy over abortion, the issue of when a fetus feels pain has become a major policy question because those who don't like abortion have tried to argue that if you're going to do abortions, and if the fetus can suffer, then you ought to give pain-controlling medication to the fetus before an abortion. Now, giving pain-controlling medications to a fetus under the best of terms is very hard. Knowing what dose, when to do it, how to administer it, how to get it in there, not well understood. The chance of an abortion clinic doing it is nothing. Critics of abortion, or those who oppose abortion, understand that full well, and they don't really want to have abortions done pre-pain control. They want to stop abortions. So by putting the requirement in that you have to control fetal pain, and there's a bill up in the state of Florida right now, but there's been federal efforts to do it. They come up a lot. It's a technique. Experts are called from the neuroscience and pediatric and other communities to say, does a fetus feel pain? Well, one source of conflict of interest, you can pretty much say if a person is pro-life, the scientists, they come in and testify that fetuses feel pain from about the age of an embryo to 85. I mean, they're just able to feel pain all the time. And the pro-choice scientists usually show up and say, not so much consensus, but we don't think it happens much before the brain's wired together enough to have some notion of self-awareness, and that wouldn't happen, long after 23, 24 weeks. It may still be happening even after birth. So you get that kind of discussion. And obviously there's some dispute here about what do you mean by pain? A aversive response? There are plenty of things fish do it. I mean, there are a lot of things that can, react to negative stimuli. I guess, if I remember right, planaria did it back to my high school science days. I mean, there are many things that'll move away from aversive things, but I don't think you want to say they're suffering or feeling pain. So, how much cognitive function do we have here? And obviously at other times, Martha's talked about this in the animal issue, and it's a very similar question. How much brain oomph do you need and so forth? But in our context, the question is, if you're going to have a discussion of fetal pain, should people, when they testify, talk about what their position is on abortion first? Should they disclose? And I've testified myself at these hearings saying I didn't think there was a consensus looking at the literature on fetal pain, so my point wasn't to be an expert on neuroscience, it was to say, if you want to base this policy on science, if you look at the literature, there isn't enough consensus about it, so you don't have the basis in science to do it. If you want to do it just because you want to arbitrarily say, after X weeks, you're going to have to administer pain control, you can do that, it just doesn't sit on any science foundation. Well, when the science experts come, how much should they talk about their personal views about abortion? And I told you already, they're pretty closely linked. I mean, I won't say there's no pro-life scientist who's ever said, I don't think a fetus can feel pain until later, and there's probably a few pro-choices around who would say earlier than a lot of the mainstream community might want to say, but generally speaking, pretty high correlation. So that's a conflict of interest question. It isn't always about money, it can be about your politics. And if you start to think about this, well, people have all kinds of biases. Somebody might say, ever since high school, I've hated Martin Seligman. And every bit of his positive psychology stuff I can't stand because I never could stand him. Should I confess that actually I'm a big critic of his because he wouldn't let me play in his backyard in the 5th grade? I mean, it has nothing to do, it's a personal vendetta. I don't like him. I just don't like the guy. How far do we go with these declarations of what might be given as conflicts? There's political issues, religious issues, personal issues. And so that leads me into the last comments. The mitigation of conflict of interest. We've talked about divesting of financial conflict. We've talked a little bit about trying to be transparent when you have a conflict to fess up to it. But there's a last tool that's out there that people forget about, and it is peer review, both for science and for therapy. What we've come to believe over time is that if you follow certain methodologies and standards of evidence, then that will help buffer both, primarily conflicts of objectivity, but even conflicts of role a little bit, but more conflicts of objectivity. So, we have a process by which claims, be they research or therapeutic, are supposed to be vetted. We send them off to journals. We try to have independent people look at our ways that we've collected information or saying that this drug works or this particular claim about the brain is true, who are not connected to us, who can challenge our methods or look at our statistics, who can say, what's your hypothesis? And I don't think that is proven by the level of data you've got. In other words, the processes of peer review within science or the scientific method are supposed to control for conflicts of interest around objectivity, which is why we don't actually say, tell me who you like and don't like and who's your enemy and all the rest of it. These days, though, there is a bit of weakening in trust in peer review. You can see people starting to say, well, do people really work at that? Do they really check the statistics? It's kind of sloppy. You can get things published if you just try hard enough. You can circulate them. Some journal will take them. If you've got the stamina and you've got the, postage, you can probably find some outlet. And if you're pushed to the wall, you can just put it up on a blog on the internet and say, I've discovered the key to genius. It's carrots. Eat a lot of carrots and that's it, and promote it. There are a lot of ways to get information out now that are not peer-reviewed. You see this in places like vaccine debates or many other areas where anybody can say anything about safety or efficacy. You can see it somewhat in neuroscience, and you can see it in areas like stem cell therapies, people touting cures all over the place on the internet. But it is our commitment to scientific method and having tough and vigorous and rigorous peer review that probably is our best way to manage conflict of interest around objectivity. I think it's better than transparency and trying to minimize it because, as I've been hinting to you, there are tons of sources of conflict of interest on objectivity. Everybody has them. We all have our enemies and our dislikes and our, I didn't even talk about this much, but we even have our cognitive sources of bias. They're just there. I want to believe that because something happens right after something else, it's a cause. And I want to believe there are probably literally dozens and dozens of cognitive bias misperceptions that we all bring to the table. Hopefully, it's by peer review scientific method that we control for that. I don't think it's just by declaring that we have enemies or are pro-life or that sort of thing. Role conflict a little tougher. Can't really control that by peer review and so on. There, you're probably going to have to do it by policy. So to control conflicts of role, it's probably going to be, here's your responsibility. You can consult 5 days a week. You can only take this much money. That's it. I don't want to hear about it anymore. I'm glad you're on TV. You can do that, 1 day a week or for an hour a week or something, and that's the end of that. If it interferes with your primary duty as a professor, then go work for the media or get a job in industry or whatever, But if your job is X, do X, and here's the limits that we will tolerate. That's a policy resolution. The other way to do it is by making sure that we have independent verification and assessment that we trust. And that's why doing peer review is so important. I'm going to end with a little downside on peer review. We don't teach it well. People usually learn to do peer review by trying to do it. No one actually says, do this, or read it this way, or do this. As I said, too, in peer review, oftentimes I think a system where people publish their peer reviews and let others see what they said, even if you don't want to put your name on it, you could still say, this is why I think this paper is bad, or this is why I think this abstract is no good, and put it online or make it accountable. So those are some ways we might strengthen it. But at the end of the day, it's trust in scientific method. And if the culture that we're in starts to weaken in its trust in scientific method, it gets more and more concerned about conflict of interest around objectivity, and that is exactly what's happening. You can see loss of faith in scientific method as a way to balance objectivity, and that's why we have a lot of concern about the objectivity of experts, the reliability of information from certain sources, the influence of the pharmaceutical industry on everything, the influence of, you pick your enemy or your boogeyman, whoever it is. It's because we have lost some faith in this country in science and the scientific method. But the reason it was there was to control for objectivity. So my argument there is it's probably going to take a renewed commitment to make sure that conflict of interest on the objectivity side is managed well. So let me stop there. I hope that helps lays out some of the swampy terrain of conflict of interest. It's pretty rich, and I can say this. Any of you who don't want to have neuroscience careers but would rather join the bioethics ranks, you can come figure out how to manage conflict of interest better, because it's certainly wide open. There's plenty to do. That's a growth area. Okay. Comments? Questions?